Okay, welcome to the podcast, and I'm happy to have everybody. And today I have somebody that I respect a lot, that I have known as a friend, as a colleague for close to a couple decades, I think, or maybe even 15 years plus. But Paul Meckman, he needs no introduction. And Paul is someone that's very passionate about everything we do and everything me and myself and him do as well in CMMI, process, Agile, cybersecurity, and these days AI. So we have a great discussion that's coming up today. Welcome, Paul, and I'll let you introduce yourself maybe a little bit quickly, and then I'll give my 2 cents on Paul first before he goes. But he's the only person, and he has that recognition, being the only person that has written a book on Agile and how structured processes like CMMI-based practices can work together, published by Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, which is the known authority for building maturity models and best practices. And he's also, some of the things that Paul does. There's a lot of things he does, but he's an avid a marathon runner for as long as I've known him. And he's the fittest person on the planet as far as I'm concerned. And I know. So Paul, is there anything you want to say before we jump into the topics?
I would just say first that my background is software development. I started as a programmer, and I worked in the defense industry for a number of companies, including Lockheed Martin towards the end before I went off on my own. So I was a hands-on guy. I wrote code, and I still love to get down into it at that level. When I went off in 1997, it's hard to believe, I've actually been consulting now longer than I worked for the defense companies. But I went off on my own, and that's when I got into the CMMI stuff. But I've always been looking at the practical side. I came at it from the perspective of the practitioner, how to help the practitioner as opposed to just coming at it from process perspective itself. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I truly appreciated in you and continue to, Paul. When we met, I think first time many years ago, the thing that stood out about you was you're very pragmatic, like us and like me, and very much wanting to apply and adopt these big technology terms and frameworks and models and whatnot into every kind of organization and company. And that still stands out as one of your, I think, very important USPs, so to speak, as a person, as an individual, as a brand. So Paul, the brand is here with us. So thank you, Paul. So let's get right into today. I want to cover about one of your passions, and that is Agile. And why don't we start with Agile? I mean, we all know what is Agile or Agile, however you want to pronounce it. But it came as sort of a revolution for software development, for basically product development. And it was basically trying to solve a big problem that there was one limited visibility into big software projects. And therefore, people were wasting money, time, cost overruns, schedule overruns, and Agile kind of came along, and then it's been pretty popular. And then there's been lots of iterations of different, I think, hybrid variants of Agile, and different companies doing it in slightly different ways. What I wanted to get into, Paul, and you're the best expert that I know in this, and I probably not get anyone else other than this, but where is Agile as a revolution, if you will, as a paradigm today?
So really, I think we have gotten to the point where it's no longer novel. It was novel for a long time, and a lot of people got excited about it because it was kind of that backlash against the heavyweight processes, and the developers really felt like they could own this kind of an approach. And it also tied into the whole idea of iterating and improving. And so today, I think in the last few years, people have realized that this isn't new anymore. We've been doing it. It's almost the natural way of working in a lot of companies. There's very few, even though the bigger companies will still talk about waterfall. I think almost all the teams are working in small agile teams, even on big waterfall projects. One interesting point I would make, the government, and I do a lot of work for the government has tried to get to Agile and hasn't done a really good job. But recently, there really is a big push for speed, and Agile is actually coming back in the government sector, in the sense of, we tried it before, we really didn't get there, but now we really need to do it. This is the way to work to get product out there faster to the warfighter. And so we see this. I actually help the Warfighter Acquisition University. I have to remember that name. It's no longer DAU, but I helped them put together some courses, and we'll talk more about this later, on cybersecurity. But there's a real tie-in here to how do we go fast, but also keep the brakes on where things are critical? Because we're also dealing with this cybersecurity problem, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So Agile is at a kind of a crossroads. We've been doing it for 20 years. A lot of companies just accept it, but it's kind of swapping, and it's saying, okay, the bigger companies who weren't doing it so much are now saying, I got to take another look at this with regard to the other goals I have. So it's not dead by any means, but it's sort of change. I'll call it at a crossroads to change a little bit the way it's being implemented, especially because of the cybersecurity, and, as I'm sure we'll talk more about, the AI problem that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, great points, Paul. And I think, one of the things that you alluded to is Agile came in because of a sort of an opposition, or a little bit of a resistance, or more of resistance to the standard waterfall or the big process and the big bureaucratic thing. And then it was trying to solve that problem. Another problem was that people I think the economy was transitioning from a development economy to a services economy. More of people wanted it now, people wanted it fast, and it was things like, you get delivery next day, you get overnight delivery on Amazon, you get a drone delivery these days, if you're lucky, within a couple hours. So I think as things were changing to expect more response times and better responsiveness, we were wanting to make product development look more like services. So we wanted more frequent interaction. We wanted to show customers prototypes, right? And it was trying to solve that big problem that some of the big waterfall heavy process methods or best practices in the companies were at it. Or basically giving that impression. So does the promise of CMMI process or any kind of other process that you may have and Agile still hold? Because obviously you've written the earliest and the only book on how these two things can coexist. It's been a wonderful success. I've implemented it with you in many places. But where do you think that sort of resistance stands today? Have companies come to the conclusion that yes, these two can successfully, happily ever after live together without any divorce, sort of thing? Where's that going?
Well, it's interesting the way you put it. I actually think that there was a point in time when Agile first came out, and is right after 2000, 2001, around there, the Agile Manifesto, and there was a sense that the CMMI might, they may just go away from this, and it may not be used. But the interesting thing is that I felt that Agile helped us implement the CMMI better. Early years of the CMMI, we got overly focused on the idea of documenting everything, and kind of overdid the process thing with heavy weight. Agile helped us figure out how to be disciplined and how to get institutionalized processes. And a lot of people don't like that word because they think rigor. but it's really about just coming up with a common way of working that the whole team can share. I often tell the story, and I think, Chris, you may recall it, about I was in one company and I thought, trying to help them prepare for CMMI, and I thought they're not going to pass the risk management area because they're not documenting their risks. And we wanted the big chart until I finally realized that these people lived and breathed risk management. They were doing it in an agile fashion. And what I would see in the company is the developers would be running to their manager's doorway and standing in the doorway, and they would be collaborating, discussing how do we mitigate this risk, and they'd come up with it. And all of a sudden, I realized this is risk management. It just, the culture was there, but we just had to help them a little bit with documenting it. And the reason we wanted to document it, I had to explain to them, why do they need to document this? Well, other people are going to come along. New developers are going to come in. You've got a great process here. We actually called this doorway risk management, and it became the common label. New kids would come in and we go, we got to teach you about the doorway risk management process. Yeah. And they literally picked it up and ran with it. So what you see here is we were meeting risk management, but we had to think about how we were doing it, because that's the thing, understand the intent. And I think that's when the CMMI model started to improve. It's when we started recognizing in some of the later versions to put the words intent and value into the model. Keep people aware of, why are you doing this? What's the value? What's the intent? We didn't have that in the earlier models. And so people got overly focused on just documenting the process, and it almost became for process sake. We had to turn that around. The other thing I would say where I think Agile helped the CMMI is we did this for performance. And now we think of the CMMI no longer as just, although some people will still call it a process framework, I call it a performance framework. Yeah. This is about better performance. That's the focus. So we've I want to say they've helped each other, because on the other side of it, there have always been what I call the agile pretenders, where they say they're agile and they're actually in chaos. They don't understand. A truly agile team is disciplined. They are rigorous. They do their daily stand-ups. They have their tasks defined. They know where they're heading. They have a goal. But there's teams that were out there in the early years of Agile that were just all over the place. CMMI helped us identify those pretenders. So I see the CMMI and Agile actually, as they've both evolved, as helping each other as we've moved forward in this. And I think they still are. They still are, because now the goal, we're all wanting to go faster, but we need to stay disciplined, especially with the problems of cybersecurity, as I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that doorway risk management, I love that example, Paul. And for me, I kind of call it as, hey, not just, how will you do this how are you going to have that institutional memory of what risks you discussed at the doorway and documented for that? I call it as, hey, you could have a Prevagen moment tomorrow when you're going to forget what you said yesterday, and you're going to have to Walgreens, and get a Prevagen. It happens to me too. Right? I got to take care of my memory. And sometimes we forget what we just discussed yesterday or day before, right?
I'm going to reach back. I use Nariva.
By the way, this is not an ad, folks, for Nariva, or we're not paid by them. We're not. That's a good example of doorway risk management. Let's talk about, that's a great transition to what I wanted to talk next, which is with things we want speed. We want faster response. At the same time, Agile teams are very discipline. There's a lot of process in Agile. That's what I call it as, right? And we know that, we see it. Now, add cybersecurity into it, we want everything to be secure as well, right? So when you want things to be fast enough, innovative enough, nowadays we want others to do things for us, systems to do things for us, talk AI about it, but we want AI to help us and do things better and sometimes even do it for us. Where do you think the defense community and the warfare community, it comes into this? I mean, they were all forced to go CMMI. Then Agile was kind of thrown at them and said, now everyone's got to do Agile and do the DevSecOps. And now they're saying, address your cybersecurity problem, because no matter how great you're doing, you got to close your doors and make sure that you have locks and keys, right? So you got to make sure everything is secure. So how does this add to the challenge of what Agile and CMMI were trying to accomplish if you throw in cyber into the mix, Paul?
So cybersecurity has become one of my passions in the last few years. And I've been spending a lot of time. I am consulting for the government in this area. I've been doing it for the last 4 or 5 years. And I come at it from an Agile perspective. And actually, I say some things that are controversial in this area. First of all, I'm going to say, I think we've made cybersecurity a much bigger problem than it needs to be. And one of the ways there's so many vendors out there with products that can come in and try to help solve your cybersecurity problem. Here's the mentality I use. I say, well, let's take the word cybersecurity. Cyber, first of all, that's digital, that's computers. But let's take security. What does security mean? For me, I love, and I actually pulled this out of one of the NIST standards. I think it was NIST 800 160. It was either volume 1 or volume 2. They're both about, one's about cybersecurity, the other one's about resilience, which is another topic that's near and dear to me. But security has to do with freedom from unacceptable losses. And I love that term. You ask yourself, the first thing you should ask yourself are, what are the losses that my company cannot afford to have? So where are the jewels that we have to protect? This could be data, it could be your applications. You need to decide what's critical, all right? That's the starting point. Understand where your losses are. And then you start to do the scenario building. You build what's called loss scenarios. How can these loss scenarios happen? And then what mitigations can I put in place in order to keep those losses from happening? So this is sort of an Agile mindset, because I'm not coming at it from trying to boil the ocean. A lot of people are out there and they're looking at the threat landscape. You can look at threats forever, because the threats are going to just keep coming. You can solve threats while the next 5 are coming. But if instead of looking at the threats landscape, think about the protection landscape. What do I need to protect? How can I protect these things from any threat? And that's a system engineering approach, because if you think about how you're going to protect it from any threat, then the next threat that comes along, it doesn't matter where it's coming from. So this is just a way to think, which is kind of an Agile mindset, because we're starting from here's what I need to do in order to protect the most critical things. You cannot protect everything. In fact, there was a phrase made by I can't recall his name now, but he was a general, and I think it was back in World War II, and he said, if you try to defend or protect everything, you will protect nothing.
Nothing. Yeah.
If you need to decide specifically what you need to protect, and then you focus on those things. It's again a very Agile mindset. You now know that no matter what happens, you know how you're going to handle the next step. So that's kind of the mentality I take towards cybersecurity. And a lot of the methods out there are going in this direction, because there's no way you're going to eliminate everything, but you want to find the biggest ones, and then you want to put some mitigations in place. And here's where this ties into the CMMI. Then you can measure. You can measure the things you put in place to see how you're doing. Have you reduced the risk of those critical items that from coming in and taking away your business.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love that analogy, Paul. And I think one of the things that we've both recognized is this aspect that cybersecurity doesn't mean you got to protect everything, and you got to de-risk your biggest risks. So it's a risk-based approach. You don't de-risk everything because you just cannot do it.
You can't
And
do it.
you think of your biggest risk, and there's this risk-based approach to cybersecurity, which I kind of love. But now the problem is we've built huge maturity models or sort of cybersecurity models and compliance on top of that and enforcing it. But that's a different story. Maybe we'll have another podcast for that. But now you put AI into all this, and we want AI to do cybersecurity. We want AI to develop software. We want AI to write code and test code and tell us what we can improve. If you throw AI into Agile, CMMI, process, cybersecurity, is it a tool? You think it's a threat? It's an empowering mechanism? Where does this come? Now in CMMI, we say the biggest thing for AI is how secure it is and how safe it is. Because if you don't have those two fundamental aspects, then your AI tool or your language model or your deep learning model, whatever you have, inference machine, or things that do work for you and take over with supervisory control with or without them, they are only as good as how secure they are, right? So to that extent, we're saying in the next version of CMMI that you and I have talked about, security is going to be required. It's mandatory if you're doing AI, right? From a CMMI perspective. Where do you think we throw AI into the mix? Is this a tool? Is this an enabler? Is it a showstopper? Is it more risky?
So the answer is all of the above. But here's the thing. There's been a lot written about the kids aren't going into computer science because they think the AI is going to take away all the jobs of developers, and I'm a firm believer that's not true. So go ahead, go into computer science, get a software engineering degree. If the jobs that are going to get lost are people who are right now doing development and don't use AI. Because if you don't use AI, you're going to be left behind. Keep this in mind. Going back to the cybersecurity, the hackers are using AI.
Yeah.
And if the hackers are using AI, they can find defects faster, right? And we can write software with AI, and we're already doing that. But remember the way AI works. AI doesn't really think. It uses patterns. It actually uses statistics, and it goes out and it gets samples of patterns. And so the patterns it's finding have those defects that we put in it as humans over many, many years. So one of the things I say, when I started I told you before, I started as a developer, and I was a troubleshooter. They wouldn't let me design code when I started. They said, go in and you have to get in here and become a debugger and fix it. I loved it. Yeah. And my thought is that's where it's going to go back to. We're going to be letting the AIs write a lot of the software, but software, the jobs that are still going to be around are fixing the problems the AIs are going to put in. We're going to have more software. There's no stopping it. There's going to be a lot of software generated. And so we're going to have to fix that software, and we're going to have to find a way to build in those checks, the monitoring for suspicious behavior, and to have those mitigations that I talk about, so that, how do I keep my company from losing its critical data, its critical applications? Where are the likely patterns where a hacker could get in? And then how do I build in the monitoring and the checks so that it doesn't bring my whole system down, so that it's resilient? Resilience is the other side of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is about prevention. We're doing all the things to prevent. Resilience is about assuming the hackers got in. Now they're in. What are you going to do now? Even if they're in, how do we figure out a way to keep the system running? That's the mentality of building monitors in that can then immediately switch to a backup system or at least alert an operator. So the one other thing I want to say on this before we jump off of it is one of the big challenges with AI is, and it's, I believe this is going to be a big thing going forward, is how much do you let the AI do? You're talking now, the term is agentic AI, where we're using agents that can do more than just go out and answer a question for me. They can build something, they can do something. But how much do we allow them to do that before you get the human into the loop? And the human has to make a decision. This is one of the big problems with AI, because we have to, from an ethics standpoint and from a lot of other standpoints, we need to have the human in there, because the AI can go out. We know they hallucinate. They go out and they can make big mistakes.
Right.
So we need to have the human in there. But figuring out that point of when the human needs to jump in, that's another part of the job. That's where software developers, the humans, are going to be going. You're going to still have to do all the think work. This is one of the things I often say. AIs don't think. They just find patterns and they can repeat patterns and give you something that sounds good. But the human has to be able to go in there and step back and go, now, wait a minute, something doesn't look right. That's where a lot of the software developers are going to be going. They're going to have to know how to do that check when it comes to the AI. So that's a big challenge.
Yeah, I love that analogy, because one of the things, so we're going to have more software written by AI. We're going to need more developers to fine tune it and find whether it's valid, it's accurate. I think I read this as more verification validation jobs,
Oh yeah,
more role shifts, and more
yes,
human involvement in making sure what it's doing, what the system's doing, is in fact doing what we're supposed to make it do.
yeah,
Right, the output's good. So I think it's a way. It's really, really good in that respect.
yeah.
That it's going to increase the demand for certain things.
One thing that you just triggered in my mind when you said that too, when we write requirements, we were taught to write the requirements as what the system needs to do functionally. It needs to do this function, that function. We never thought, back when I went to school, to write requirements that are what are referred to as negative requirements. What do you want the system not to be able to do?
Yeah.
But with cybersecurity, we have to think that way, because the hackers are in there trying to use the system to do something nefarious. And so we have to have requirements to keep the system from to do what it's supposed to do and no more. So it's a different way to think now when you're developing software. And this is part of the things that we have to teach to new software developers, to think in terms of think like a hacker. That's going back to when I was a troubleshooter and a tester. That's one of the things that's great about being a tester. You kind of have to think from the mentality of okay, sort of like a detective, and you're going in there, but you have to think like a hacker would too, that could go in and break the system.
Yeah, and you had to actually test. My first job was actually doing, watching releases and overnight releases to find errors, what the release process would tell me and what the run would tell me, and give it to the developers. Here's where the errors were. So that was even a lower level job. Configuration management. That's essentially build and release is what I was put on first. It was a great job because I learned a lot of what could break. And then I'll try and break it myself, But those are the good old days. But Paul, let's kind of wrap it up by saying great conversation. So for someone who's in the trenches like you and me are, someone who's doing a CMMC or CMMI assessment, where they are thinking of also, running, where they have projects running an Agile team and they're managing AI adoption. So there's all these things thrown in. You're doing a CMMI assessment where they have an Agile teams and they're managing AI adoption within the project, right? How do you think all this will play out? What's the intersection of process maturity, capabilities, cybersecurity, AI? 5 years from now, is this going to redefine the whole thing? Is it going to make it more narrower, more focused? And all of these are getting more attention, and things that we thought were relic. For example, hey, maybe overhead processes are a relic, but CMMI is still relevant. It's become performance oriented. We've added a lot of things to it. There's AI into it now. Cybersecurity is obviously front and center, and AI is front and center, right? So if we are doing all these things in a company and assessment, then where do you think 4 years from now, 5 years from now, what's the intersection look like to you, Paul?
So I do think that the CMMI or a similar maturity model, a general,
Yeah,
still needs to be the fundamental part. But I'm a multi-framework kind of guy,
yeah,
and I think it's fine that we have specialized areas. And the term framework has just been exploding
yeah,
lately
yeah,
because there's framework, all kinds of frameworks for zero trust, which is
yeah,
another word that
yeah.
really, in the cybersecurity area. Here's the way I think of these frameworks. If good frameworks are like checklists in a positive way. We haven't used the checklist word. Checklists got a bad name, and they do have a bad name if they're used with a checklist mentality. Check the box. But checklists can be very good if they're reminders. And frameworks that just have reminders for things to you to think about can be a good thing. And I like it from that perspective. The one thing I tell all my clients, and I'm constantly harping on this, the frameworks, the models, and even AI
Mhm.
cannot do the engineering work. It can't do the think work. And that's the danger we have, is that because they can snap off these really nice answers that look good, developers can start to think, well, my job's done. I'll just use what the AI told me. We need to continue to do the think work and to validate, getting back to your point, verification and validation, because they will put errors in that sound right. So that's going to be the big challenge going forward, to not get complacent and just accept these nice sounding and code that looks well written and runs. They can do syntactically perfect code that will go through the compiler, but does it do what we want it to do and only what we want it to do? This
Yeah.
is now going to be the job of the developers. And again, I want to highlight the only what we want it to do from the cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, great, Paul. Great talking to you. And one thing I can conclude from this awesome meeting, as it's always been with you and talking to you, regardless of whether we podcasted or not, is that this is, brains like you. We still need more brains like you, perhaps me, but we still have a lot of plenty of jobs going around, and I think we'll have more demand with all these things put in together instead of saying, oh, it's going to take away jobs. Yes, there are going to be job losses, but at a different level. But we're also going to think a lot more verification, validation, security, and more code means more errors, like you say,
Right.
more
Right.
possibility of errors,
Yes.
and more automated code kind of doubles and exponentially increases it. So
Yep.
I think we're all in good for a good run, Paul, and that tells me that it's probably time for you to take your run with your with your. But hey, it was always so nice to talk to you. We'll keep going, and maybe we'll do some new threads and shorter podcasts and smaller things. But that said, thank you so much, Paul. I'm blessed to call you as one of my friends, and we'll continue to work as long as we physically can and everything. Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you. Thank you, Chris. I enjoyed
Thank
it.
you. Thank you. Thank you.